Is Omicron the final swan song for COVID-19? If so, ditching those pharmaceutical companies that have been the talk of the town for the last couple of years would seem to be the call. That is assuming the threat to us all is in the descendancy and economies can now fully regroup. Or is the future more of the same? More variants of COVID, vaccines and so more opportunities in the pharma, biotech and life science sectors. Welcome to today's IG Trading the Markets podcast. I'm Jeremy Naylor. We're back today with a guest we've spoken to several times here on the platform since the first lockdown. He's a medically trained doctor, but who has built major healthcare franchises for leading UK brokers and investment banks, raising over £2 billion for the sector. Dr. Navid Malik, Head of Life Sciences Research at the Life Sciences Division. It's a pleasure to have you back on the pod today to discuss where we are in the big picture for the virus and to discuss your research as an analyst in this area. Welcome back.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Before we look at the sector as an investment or trading opportunity, let's just reacquaint ourselves, if we can, with the overall developments with your medical hat on. When we spoke to you last year, you said then that you foresaw a new variant coming out of an area in the world where the vaccine rate was likely to be low. To what degree has Omicron lived up to that forecast?
But Jeremy, it's actually very interesting. When Omicron first emerged around last November, we were disheartened by the fact that a new variant of COVID-19 had come through and emerged in the South African region, because we'd flagged that region as being a particular hotspot, a troubling update that really gave us food for thought in terms of what type of characteristics that virus would have. And what we found, we did a lot of calls with South African hospitals, doctors, and we also engaged with some of the more ground level healthcare providers in that region. And what we found was that the Omicron variant was completely different. I mean, one of the challenges we realized very quickly, and looking at literature as well, was that Omicron is in fact a brand new virus. It's got no genetic relationship to Delta or some of the other variants of concern. And what's unusual about that is, as each variant of concern emerges, you can always trace it back forensically in a genetic sense to a previous version that was circulating. With Omicron, it seems to have popped up from nowhere. And one of our concerns as a result of that is, has the virus gone back into an animal and then transferred back into a human, having seen those substantial numbers of mutations in the virus, particularly in the spike protein? Has the virus circulated in a HIV patient, as it first did with the previous South African variant, where, for example, in a HIV patient, because they're unchecked in terms of their immune system, the virus has free rein to explore every single mutation it can get away with. And then you see this kind of hypermutational version of the virus emerge. Or has the virus in fact evolved below the radar screen from an existing variant and somehow not been detected? So these were troubling questions for us. But I think the big issue for us was really our surprise at how transmissible this particular variant was compared to Delta.
So what's your next best guess then for where the virus goes from here? I said at the top, is this the swan song for COVID-19? In other words, is Omicron this event that's going to take us down a gentle slope down to something that we can all cope with as a general cold every year? Or do you see another wave causing us cause for concern, which brings into play the opportunities in the biotech sector as investors?
I completely agree with the concept that, this particular version of COVID-19 is much less lethal, in the sense that we know that hospitalizations compared to Delta are down between 90 and 96%. What particularly concerns me is the origin of what we know about the genetic makeup of the virus. So when we talk about whether the virus is in its sort of final legs and it's now going to become more like a common cold, I think we have to be wary of the fact that we've only had surprises with COVID-19 and the family of variants that we've been exposed to. So my concern is that we're going to end up in a situation where the virus is going to continue to evolve. There is no guarantees that the virus is going to become less lethal. I mean, I think if you look at the unvaccinated population, there's still a high level of deaths occurring in that population, albeit the vaccinated population are very well protected for the time being. So I think this isn't the swan song for the virus. I think it's just taking a breather. what's concerning me the most actually is that if you look at the mutations that Omicron has manifested, there's a particular insertion event. This is where a part of a gene gets inserted into the virus, DNA, RNA, and that particular sequence has come from, we believe in the papers that published in the literature, suggest it's come from another common cold virus, or indeed the HIV virus. So that hadn't been seen before. So that hasn't been flagged very well, I think, to your listeners or to even in the scientific community. But the fact that there's an insertion rather than just a mutation or deletion in this virus is perhaps a concern for what could come next. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, we are going to go into more dangerous territory in terms of variants that we can't handle. Obviously, we're getting, you know, very good vaccination rates. That's particularly important in the developing world. But I don't think we can predict what this virus is going to do next.
It's interesting you talk about vaccination rates. I noticed this morning that Pfizer and BioNTech have started a trial for Omicron-specific COVID vaccine. Like you, I know that I'm boosted. I've had the first 2 jabs and I'm boosted, and obviously, presumably at some point, I'm going to have some other offer of some other booster jab to help me through. From what I understand, the vaccines as they are at the moment are not going to protect us in the future. So is my understanding then that we're going to have more vaccines to counter more variants over a longer period of time? Is that what you expect as a medical person?
Yes, absolutely, Jeremy. I strongly believe that we need to refresh our vaccines. With our original conversation, I think we were talking about the fact that we need a pan-corona solution. In other words, we need a vaccine that can hit a number of different coronaviruses, including all the variants of COVID-19, present and future. But the fact that Pfizer is doing a refresh with BioNTech is a good thing. It will create a dilemma because obviously, whilst Omicron is the substantial variant that's circulating, Omicron, unfortunately, is already started to mutate further. There's a sort of BA2 version that's come through with some further mutations in the virus that have manifested themselves. So it's great that we got these new armaments arriving, new vaccines, but actually I don't think we need a sort of version 1 to version 1.1 improvement on the vaccines. I think we need a real grassroots, rigorous rethink about how we create vaccines, because one of the challenges we have is that we're very focused with these vaccines on attacking the spike protein through the antibodies we generate from the vaccination. And yet the spike protein is finding it easier and easier to evade the immunity that's generated from these vaccines. And hence the 4th dose, for example, that was administered in Israel, they not only found a sort of lower level of antibodies being elicited from that dose being administered to those healthcare workers, but they also found in the case of Pfizer and potentially Moderna that in those particular trials, breakthrough infections were quite common with Omicron. In other words, the vaccine was not as protective from infection. Caveating all of that, Jeremy, it's very important to stress that it's not just antibodies that protect us, it's T cells. Once the virus enters the cell, a T cell has the ability to basically destroy the cell that's full of viral particles before it spreads further. And our T cell responses seem to be pretty robust. That said, we definitely do need a flu-like situation where we have, I think, not so much an improvement every year, but perhaps we've got to rethink, as I said earlier, a vaccine that will elicit antibodies to different parts of the virus, not the spike protein alone, but the envelope protein, the nucleocapsid, all parts of the virus. And the reason why I mention that is because when you look at the antibodies from recovered patients who've been infected with any variant of concern, they have a range of antibodies, not just to the spike protein, but to every part of the virus. It's almost like your body wants to find every, chink in the armor to attack the virus. And so just sort of unidirectionally focusing our immune system on the spike protein is not a good thing. But I absolutely believe we cannot stand still in terms of vaccine development. We need 2nd and 3rd generation vaccines.
What about vaccine combinations? Is that going to come in as more and more of an option?
That's exactly right. Yes, you're spot on, Jeremy, because if you think about flu vaccines, they tend to have 4 different epitopes that they're targeting of the current flu virus that's circulating, in the southern hemisphere before it gets to us in the northern hemisphere in our cold and flu season. And from that perspective, there is every reason to believe that we may end up with a sort of a combination effect. Perhaps we'll have an mRNA product which will have two different spike proteins that would maybe be created inside the muscle when it's administered into the subject. It may be difficult for the immune system to potentially process that, because one of the concerns I also have, and this was outlined in our original research of February the 1st last year, is that the immune system needs to understand and be taught how to recognize the antigenic parts of the spike protein. In other words, if there are subtle changes to the spike protein that aren't immunogenic, then what's your immune system looking for? What will it attack? So there are some longer term concerns. And I think that also perhaps suggests that we probably need to develop better antibody therapies as well. Obviously, we had initial success with Lilly and Regeneron, but more recently, GSK and Via Biotech have come through with a drug called Xevudy, which is an antibody product. And what's interesting about that product is it actually elicits a part of your immune system, engages with a part of your immune system once a virus is bound, which is potentially a better way of engaging your immune system to react more thoroughly to the virus.
How long will it take to develop these new vaccines? Once we've got them on the shelf, which of course we now have a wide range of them. You mentioned the RNA type, and I know there's other types out there. And my understanding is that some of these drugs, you can actually almost manipulate them in a computer program and then start production. So my understanding is it seems to the pharmaceutical sector seems to be looking at a far shorter time now between the initial preparation of the formula, if you like, and the actual bringing the drug to the market, because I mean that is going to be critical, isn't it? Is actually bringing these things to the market as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. And because of the fact that we've only got 52 or 53% or so of the population globally who've been vaccinated with any particular dose, there's a real need to speed up the process of new vaccine development, particularly obviously with COVID-19. So from that perspective, because we already had the emergency use authorization pathway that the FDA created, and of course our MHRA, the regulator in the UK, has been outstanding in terms of their expedited review of products, both drugs and vaccines for COVID, I think what we'll find is that the regulators will not want to put barriers in front of these companies, or even companies that are generating second or third generation vaccines, in order for new products to reach the market. They may not get to market in a sort of in an easy way. There may still be some hurdles, but I would suggest that the risk reward ratio is very much in favor of the originator of these companies that are producing the vaccines, because the regulators and the healthcare agencies won't want to see us, falling short in terms of the protection we're getting, particularly if there's a variant that emerges that it could be more complex in nature or has a greater degree of lethality. So I fully expect the expedited paths to, if they're not there right now because they've been sort of superseded because we've got products on the market now, they may well be reinvigorated. And definitely I'm seeing both FDA in the US and MHRA, as I said, in the UK, adopting a really good positive stance in terms of their receptiveness to new products and getting them to market as quickly as possible.
Let me switch now and take a look in some more detail about what's going on in the sector, and using you as an analyst to as a sounding board as to where we go from here. Clearly, the last 2 years have been the sector's been in focus. We have seen a sell-off, interestingly, in some of these companies. Your large cap tier one this time last year in a publication you issued, you had AstraZeneca, BioNTech, and GlaxoSmithKline. Your large cap tier two, Moderna, Pfizer, all big names, with names we have come to recognize and understand how they help us, or have been helping us through COVID. Do you see that changing anytime soon? I mean, what other names are out there that are taking part in these new vaccines and this new sort of way in which we view the pharma sector?
Our actual recommendations, we're very pleased with them, with the tier one a large cap and a tier two large cap. There was something like a mean return across the board of around 30 to 35%. Some of them were up. Pfizer was up as much as 50% since our recommendations went out. So we're very pleased with what we've seen so far. It's quite tricky to, as you dive deeper down into the sector, it's quite tricky to pick companies without seeing good data and predict which companies to perhaps on a risk reward basis adopt or invest into. And obviously, I'm not making any assertions in that respect, but I do believe strongly that there's a couple of things to weigh up. One, we're going to continue to need COVID vaccines, and the current vaccines and therapeutics will need to be updated. So that won't necessarily come from the original companies that are in large cap companies that we've talked about. That may come from other companies that either are acquired by these large cap players or which will emerge with good data that will come up onto our radar screen. The second thing is that whilst the pharmaceutical sector has done very well, much like the tech sector, the biotechnology space has been pretty much derated by around 30% or so in some cases over the last few months, particularly since November. And I think that's presented a very interesting opportunity to look again at the biotechnology sector globally. And it's the biotech sector, in fact, that will deliver the solutions. If you think about it, whether you're looking at AstraZeneca for their adenoviral vector vaccine, or you look at Pfizer, which is obviously partnered with BioNTech, or you look at Moderna, all of the vaccines currently that are making a big impact all came from the homes of biotech companies. All of them were in-house developed by biotech and then subsequently licensed to pharma. So I think when you look at the sector, the biotech sector for us is highly attractive. There are so many strong fundamentals about the sector compared to where it was 10 years ago. A maturity of the pipelines, a de-risking, a success in orphan diseases or rare diseases. There's been that challenge of, are the regulators pushing back on innovation or are they embracing it? And I can very much confirm that they've been embracing innovation for the last few years, hence the number of products getting to market in an expedited manner. And also a number of firsts, gene therapies, cell therapies, other type of products that have that level of innovation are coming to market very quickly. The data is robust, no one's compromising on safety. And what's particularly interesting is that we're seeing, particularly with US FDA, a level of acceptance that the traditional way in which we would view a clinical trial being deployed, the two arms, the placebo and the control arm, being run together, competing with each other to try and see if a drug or therapeutic has a benefit. That concept seems to be evolving, and there seems to be some measure of the regulators thinking that maybe we should be doing trials where you only have a single late stage phase 3 arm and you use the control arm from historical data or from real world data. Now that's coming from a paper that the FDA authored that was published last week. That for me is a huge revolution in the way that the regulators perceive the path to market for products. And it's going to, in my view, simplify clinical trials, speed clinical trials up because you'll be recruiting fewer patients, and give smaller companies greater granularity and greater success in getting potential much needed products to market. So from all of that, when you round it off, this sector is a core holding. Both the pharmaceutical and biotech sector are a core holding in our belief for institutional and professional investors.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, about the fact that they're wanting to speed up this process, which before had certainly seemed to be a very laboured and long drawn out process, as many who have been monitoring drug company progress over the years. So this does almost usher in a new era, I think. But presumably at the same time, one assumes it also reduces costs in the process.
Absolutely. The costs will be reduced. I mean, the other thing to perhaps focus on, Jeremy, is the fact that we still have receding, I might add, pressure on the NHS, but think about the number of trials that are being disrupted from the fact that the hospitals can no longer accept, patients coming in freely. Think about the backlog in surgeries. There's something like 6 million at the moment in the UK, procedure-wise. So, we absolutely, it's not just the catch-up that's needed. We need to speed things up because I think what COVID has told us, particularly with the vaccines and the therapeutics that have been approved, is that we don't have to stick to the old playbook. We don't have to spend, $1 billion and 10 plus years developing a product to market. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical companies rightly will say, well, we're going to charge a large amount of money because we've got to pay for the failures. But if the successes are coming in 3 to 5 years and they're costing tens of millions, then naturally, not only would you have innovation leading the way, but pricing will be better as well. It will be more aligned with both the patient and the payer, something that we can all afford. So I think going forward, I've said this probably for the last 10 years, so it's perhaps a bit of a cliche, but we are in the renaissance period for the sector. We're looking back already and we're thinking to ourselves, how have we managed to get the substantial progress that we've seen in the last 10 or so years behind us? How has that success been delivered? We almost missed it because we keep seeing the noise and we're not looking for the data. But when you look at the data, we are in an absolutely amazing time in the sector. And I think that just as people have big core holdings in banks and the technology space, this sector, which is, despite the correction on the smaller cap end, is having a great run, will continue. And it's going to be this century, as many people have said previously, and I've said the same, this century is a century of biotech. It's going to be a transformation for all of us.
Just one final question, and it does touch back on this idea of COVID. Just tell us a little bit about the new innovations that are coming along. We haven't really spoken about a COVID pill yet. I know that some of the press is getting excited about the prospect of this sort of thing. So if someone has COVID, you go into hospital, you take a pill, and it helps the effects or so forth. We haven't really got anything that's effective yet in that regard. Is that something, do you think, that's really coming?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Again, we've had the Pfizer and Merck have had approvals for a protease inhibitors pills, basically, which are for early stage disease. So they're for vulnerable patients who could be at risk of hospitalization. And so they'll take these pills, and then they've had good success in showing they can reduce the risk of those vulnerable patients ending up in hospital. However, if you are in hospital, we have a really poor armament. We have very little choices about what you can give patients, perhaps even for the more moderate to severe end of the disease before you arrive in hospital. So I think there's still a wide open playbook there. We've got to figure out where we go, but we definitely need an orally delivered pill that you can basically take, before you run the risk of your virus overloading your system and perhaps hospitalizing you. So we don't have something that's sort of bulletproof yet, but I'm actually more intrigued about getting therapies that can salvage and save patients from the mortality risks of COVID. In other words, we have great success with the vaccination programs, but if we were told that, well, actually, if you do become very ill, we have a range of therapies that we can give you, and we pretty much know that you'll be okay, you'll recover, then that would change the dynamic of this whole pandemic going into endemic situation. At the moment, if you're vulnerable or you have an underlying medical condition that increases that vulnerability and you end up in hospital, or you're unvaccinated, things can be looking very bleak, and things happen fast. Whilst Omicron, for example, has an extremely high transmission rate, it isn't as lethal. It circulates in the upper airways, doesn't go into the lungs. But what if a variant emerges that does go into the lungs very efficiently? What are we going to do then?
Interesting. Look, that's for another time, I guess, when we come across that, and we can talk about that in future broadcasts. But look, Navid, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much indeed for joining us with this view of the markets as things stand at the moment with regard COVID and the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors. That's Dr. Navid Malik, Head of Life Sciences Research at the Life Sciences Division. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.